Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about protein-sparing modified fasts, which are a great tool for rapid fat loss and healing, but also just about our bodies and how our bodies are designed and how they work and how they process fuels, which is very important to know exactly how your body deals with different fuels as they come in through the diet. Because this is how we can understand our biology and how we can leverage that biology to lose more fat and maintain muscle and get the body recomposition we really want. So let's take a look at protein-sparing modified fast. First of all, disclosures, we've published a bunch of books and we do health coaching and consulting services for almost 20 years now, Maria and I. But how our bodies process fuels. Let's just talk first as kind of a baseline of how our bodies process the fuels when they come in through the diet. This is very important, and the body has a very specific way that it does this. And so it's important to understand that process. Our blood vessels are very much like fuel lines in a car, okay? This is important because this is how our bodies process fuels when they come in. And our bodies are much like a car in that you don't want too much fuel in the fuel lines at any given moment because you can blow the engine up, right? So our blood vessels are very much the same. You want to tightly control how much fuel gets to the engine. Your engine is your body. Too much fuel can blow up the engine. The body tightly controls how much fuel is in the blood. At any given moment, you have about 80 calories of fuel in your entire blood volume of your entire body. And that's at rest. And that's anything from any fuels like glucose, alcohol, ketones, free fatty acids, all of those together, it's usually around about 80 total calories. So when you have fuels coming in, whether you're drinking alcohol or you're taking exogenous ketones or you're eating meals with glucose or fat in them, it's a lot of calories coming in, and the body has to prioritize and deal with those that flood of calories very quickly, or you can have issues. Too much of any of those fuels can kill you. We know that you can get alcohol poisoning if you have too much alcohol in the blood. You can die of ketoacidosis if you have too many blood ketones in the blood, and as well as blood typically happens with too much glucose as well. But if you have blood ketones in the 30s, that's could be life-threatening. If you have too high of blood glucose, we all know that's hyperglycemia, and you can die from too high of blood glucose as well. And you can die of too much fat in the blood. If you have hypertriglyceridemia, that's too much fat in the blood, it can kill you. So you can see all these different fuels. If any of them get too high in the blood, you could die. And so the body has to prioritize these fuels because it doesn't want to blow the engine. So at rest, I misspoke. At rest, the total of all fuels in the blood, and that's from ketones, glucose, free fatty acids, is about 30 calories in your entire blood volume. You think about glucose, a normal glucose reading of 85 milligrams per deciliter is about 4 grams of glucose or 16 calories in your entire blood volume. So it's not a lot of fuel. So the body has to deal, when you consume macros, when you consume calories, your body has to deal with these quickly so that you don't get into a dangerous state. So dietary alcohol or exogenous ketones, a very kind of interesting note about these two, there's little to no storage capacity for either of these. And so alcohol, there's no place to store it. The body cannot store alcohol. The body has to prioritize alcohol because it can't store it anywhere, so it's got to burn it off first before it gets too high in the blood. And so you'll see a sort of shift when you drink alcohol, in that it says, I got alcohol to deal with, get rid of the other fuels so that I can deal with just burning off this alcohol. So it drives down glucose, drives down ketones, drives down fatty acids. And so it's prioritizing that because it can't store it. And ketones are much the same. If you drink exogenous ketones, you're going to immediately shut off lipolysis. Lipolysis is the process of your body burning its own fat for fuel. And the second you drink alcohol or you drink exogenous ketones, it's going to shut that off. Because think about it, your body is creating its own ketones and it's going along and it's great. Maybe your blood ketones are 1.0 or something. And suddenly you flood it with a bunch of exogenous ketones in a drink, and that gets into the blood, and the blood ketones shoot up. The body's gonna say, whoa, I got enough. The first thing it's gonna do is shut off making ketones from your own fat. So that's the first thing that's gonna happen. It's gonna shut down lipolysis and start dealing with the ketones it has coming in through this drink or exogenous or external source. So both alcohol and exogenous ketones will immediately put the brakes on lipolysis and stop burning your own fat for fuel. In fact, the effect is so strong that you'll often see alcoholics, if they come into a hospital and they're a chronic, drunk every minute of every day kind of alcoholic, you'll see very low blood glucose levels, even if they're eating lots of carbs. And that's the strength of this process of what's called oxidative priority, where it's saying, I've got to deal with alcohol, drive down the other fuels. And so even if they're eating lots of carbs, they'll have A1Cs in the 4s, if not sometimes 3s, because alcohol is chronically elevated. So let's talk about the next fuel, which is not really a fuel, and why it's lower in priority, is dietary protein. So when you eat protein, it's preferentially used to build muscle. Amino acids are very important for the body to build and rebuild its lean mass. It's estimated that our daily basal metabolic rate, that's how many calories you burn all day long just by living, is up to 20% due to autophagy. So up to 20% of the energy your body consumes just existing, your BMR, is related to autophagy, which is cellular turnover. Autophagy is the process where the body takes cells that are damaged or failing, and it breaks them apart and builds new ones from the parts and amino acids. It's the body's constantly turning over its cells. And in fact, the man who won the Nobel Prize for autophagy, he estimated that our bodies, our cellular turnover, all our cells are turned over in about 3 months, which is stunning to think of, that you're a different person at the cellular level, made up of different cells than you were 3 or 4 months ago. So dietary protein is very important because that's what supports this process. That's where these amino acids come from, where you're building and maintaining lean mass. You think about skin, how much skin you lose every day, how many pounds. I mean, you need a lot of amino acids. So the body is going to preferentially use protein to build and maintain lean mass. Turning it into glucose is a process called gluconeogenesis, which is possible, but it's only done as a demand-driven process. So if the blood glucose gets too low and it needs more glucose and there's not enough around in the liver or the diet, it'll turn some of the protein into glucose to keep blood sugars where they should be, not going too low. It's demand driven, and that's an important point to understand. Dietary carbohydrates are the next priority of fuels. And you'll notice something here as we go down this list. We started with things that had 0 storage capacity, so they have to be burned off first. Things that have storage capacity, like carbohydrates, they're lower priority because the body can say, okay, I'm going to store this off while I deal with these other fuels that are coming in that I can't store. It makes sense. If you have a gas tank, why send all the fuel to the engine? No, send it to the gas tank and then deal, with what you have to burn off. And so carbohydrates have a moderate storage capacity. If you look at the typical person in their muscle and liver glycogen storage, it's anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 calories or so of glucose that can be stored. This is sugar and starch. So basically all digestible carbs end up as glucose. Two biological pathways for glucose, which is to either be burned as fuel or stored in your muscle or liver as glycogen. But muscle glycogen is locked up in the muscle. This is a key point too. You start thinking about, well, I did a little workout, or I did a brisk walk, for an hour. I got to top up my glycogen stores because I used them up when I did that walk. That's not the case. So muscle glycogen is locked in the muscle, and it can't come back out once it's locked in. So in other words, if your blood glucose dips a bit low and you need more blood glucose, you can't pull it out of the muscle to supply that. It's locked into the muscle. You can get it from the liver if there is available in the liver. But muscle glycogen is locked in the muscle. And not only is it locked in the muscle, but it's really only used by the muscle for intense exercise. And so this is kind of our evolutionary perspective, our fight or flight. So if you have to run from a lion, that glycogen is there to power those muscles at a speed that you can sustain for a while to get away and to survive. But if you just are doing a brisk walk or a typical workout, you're lifting weights and doing these things, you're not really tapping much of the muscle glycogen until you get to high intensity, sprints, very long workouts, like you run a marathon. Okay, now you're tapping into it because the duration of the exercise, those kind of things, where you're going to start tapping into that muscle glycogen. But many times a typical workout won't really tap into that much. But anyway, excess beyond storage capacity. Let's say your storage capacity is full, and your liver's full, and you've got a lot in the blood, and now the body has got to do something with it, so it can turn the excess carbohydrates or glucose in the blood into fat. Essentially, turns it into a triglyceride and then stores it into your fat cells. This is not, but there's a misconception out there of that's where all the fat, when you're in a carb burner, the fat on your body was carbs turned into fat and stored. In reality, it's actually not the case. Most of the fat stored on your body came from dietary fat. It's just that the carbohydrates were always elevated, and so that they take priority from oxidative priority. So all the fat that came with the carbohydrates just got stored away while we're dealing with chronically elevated carbohydrates. So then that leaves us with dietary fat. And the interesting thing about dietary fat, and this is something in the keto world that gets a little contentious, is that dietary fat really only has 3 biological pathways. Once you put it in your mouth, there's only 3 places it can go. It can either get digested and absorbed into the body, into the bloodstream, which the vast majority of it does. It gets packaged up as a chylomicron, and it can either go over to the muscle and be burned as fuel, which most of it doesn't. Most of it, once it comes into the diet, again, you're getting a flood of, if you've got 20 calories of fat in your entire blood volume at any given rested state, remember that if it was all fat, which it isn't, but you're really talking about maybe 1 to 2 grams of fat in your entire blood volume. So 1 gram of fat in your entire blood volume, and you just ate a meal with 40 grams of fat in it, well, it's got to deal with that. And it's not going to get burned. Not very little of it will get burned. So most of it goes into storage. So most of the fat you eat goes first into fat storage, into your fat cells. The other place it could go is out the small intestine, which means not get absorbed. So it goes out through the fecal matter. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you look at all of this, and I know Dave Feldman's got some great information on this about LDL particles and what they are. Well, if you look at them, you can look at this here. The blue is triglycerides. That's fat. So a lot of these particles are really made up of, you see chylomicrons, almost all fat. As it comes in to the intestine, it's a big package of fat, goes right into the fat cells and gets stored. So this is the basic pathway for dietary fat. Let's talk about some of the, like I mentioned, the contention here, and that is, does it pass through the colon? So this is one of the things that you'll hear certain people in the keto community say, is that it just goes through you. First of all, studies don't support that. There has been studies on this. The study that I'll link here and put in the notes shows that only about 3 to 5% of your dietary fat intake, less than 10 grams per day total, ends up in the stool. So in this study, they did low fat and high fat differences between the groups, and it didn't really change much how much fat ended up in the stool, the low fat versus the high fat, and the amount that was in the stool stayed constant, and it was less than 10 grams per day, regardless if you ate low fat or high fat. So it's not just going through the stool. And another point of this that will hammer this home is, if it did, you would have problems. So olestra, which was a fat that you didn't digest, and they made these chips, these Olean, I think was the name of the chips a while back, is like in the 80s. Low fat craze, because the fat wasn't absorbed, and so they fried it in this Olean, and it went right through you, and they had to put a warning label that it caused anal leakage, because that extra 10 grams to maybe 20 grams of fat a day going out caused you to not be able to control your stool. You would have some serious issues. So it's not going out the colon. A large amount of fat in stool is not normal. It would not be very comfortable. So in this example, the two diets, so in this study, this was a study that they did here, had similar calorie intakes, and of the 40 students, they varied the fat content of the diet from 93 grams to 168 grams per day, and a total calorie intake remained relatively constant, but the results showed no significant differences in fecal fat excretion. Okay, so here's the wow chips, because what an appropriate name, wow, because you end up with anal leakage, because that fat went right through them. And this is the warning label, one of the warning labels they had to put on the product. So know that you don't magically with keto just dump tens of grams of fat out of your colon. That's not where it's going. In this case, anal leakage with an extra few grams of fat. So dietary fat, sorry, I'm just moving this out of the way. Dietary fat, where is it going? Vast majority goes through the main two pathways. It's not going out the colon. It's not going out in the stool. It stays relatively constant, even from low fat to high fat, and it's a very small amount, less than 10 grams, typically like 4 or 5 grams of fat ends up in the stool. Chylomicrons going to the muscle to be burned as fuel. There's some, but not a lot, because any given moment, unless you're exercising and doing intense workouts, there's not a lot of energy needs by the muscle and tissues at any given time. So not a lot of it's going there. Where's most of the fat in your mouth going? It's going into fat storage. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but if your goals are to lose body fat, to reduce the size of your adipose tissue, your fat cells, then you want to be conscious of this. So what happens when we eat? This is another thing that we hear people talk about, where fearing insulin, and it's kind of gone so far in the other direction, where any rise in insulin they fear as a problem or something. And in reality, insulin is not an absolute enemy to the body. Chronically elevated insulin is a problem, but transient insulin, insulin that goes up and comes back down when you eat a meal, that's totally normal and it's required. Huge increases in fuel coming into the blood when you eat. Again, back to the 20 calories in your entire blood volume. That's a normal energy in the blood. If you eat a 500 calorie meal, the body's got to prioritize. It's got to deal with those fuels. It doesn't want to blow up the engine. Body must shut down endogenous production of fuels. So when you eat, it's got to stop burning fat from your own fat stores. It's got to stop releasing glucose from the liver. It shuts all that down because it doesn't want an oversupply of fuel in your blood. Then it prioritizes fuels to store, using oxidative priority. So again, in basically reverse order of storage, it's going to say, I got alcohol, I can't store this, so I got to burn this first, store these other things away. And then once you're back to tight fuel control in the blood, and you've processed all that fuel that came in, then fat flux can resume. And fat flux is the process of burning fat from your fat stores. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what's good to note here is here's a chart from our keto book. This is the insulin response to different macros consumed. Carbohydrates, of course, have the largest insulin response. Fat is protein is in between because you need insulin to utilize protein. So you have a little bit of an insulin spike with protein, but you need it because otherwise you can't build lean mass and use the protein. You also, even with fat, you do get an insulin rise with fat, and it is enough of a rise to store fat. It has to be. Again, you don't want to blow up the engine, so you don't want all this fat coming into the blood, and you don't have enough insulin rise to store that fat away. If you only ate fat, you didn't eat any protein or carbohydrates, and you just ate fat, unless you're going to die of hypertriglyceridemia with too high a fat in the blood, you got to store that fat away. So you need insulin to rise a little bit, and it's enough to store the fat you ate. It has to be. So just this is something that I get annoyed with as well, is people saying things like, well, I'm going to drink a bulletproof coffee to extend my fast, as if those calories don't count, or as if somehow that fat doesn't go anywhere. Well, it's going to raise your insulin, which is probably going to affect your fast, and all that fat just gets put into storage. So not a great idea. So here's a little chart of oxidative priority that I put together. It shows the order of priority. So you have alcohol number 1 because there's no storage capacity. Exogenous ketones are number 2 and pretty much the same, no storage. Protein is number 3, and protein storage, you could argue in this case, because it is prioritized as a building block for lean mass, for muscle and tissues, that your storage of it is in the tissues. So you have a lot of, muscle and whatnot to turn over and use. But carbohydrates, you have anywhere from 1,200 to maybe 2,000 calories of storage capacity, and it's number 4. And then fat is the last priority, because you basically have unlimited fat storage. There are people, that are hundreds of pounds overweight, walking around with 1 million calories of stored fat on their body. So it's kind of theoretically unlimited, and that's why it's the last priority. So what happens when you eat, for example, a couple of beers, a cheeseburger, and some French fries? Well, the first thing is you've got alcohol coming in from the beer. And so that is going to go into the mitochondria and get used as fuel. Protein was in the burger itself. That will get used up as broken down into amino acids and used to build lean mass. So that's getting into the building lean mass. So that's kind of green here. But this is the fuel that's being dealt with because it's alcohol and there's no storage. The carbs that were in the bun and the beer and the French fries, all of that is going into storage because you've got elevated alcohol, and you got to deal with that first. So that goes into your liver and muscle glycogen. And by the way, if that's already full and there's no place for it to go, the excess can be turned into fat and stored in your fat cells. The fat that came from the burger, the cheese, and whatever else you ate with that meal, straight into storage, because it's got to deal with the alcohol that's elevated. So this is also a good example of why keto can be helpful for weight loss, because if you don't drink alcohol, you get enough protein to build lean mass, you cut out all the carbs, and then you adjust fat based on your goals, you're just left down to fat as your fuel. That's what you want for fat loss. So I mentioned fat flux, which is kind of this process of the body having fat churning in and out of the fat cells all the time. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we took the part of that graph we had earlier and just looked at the liver and the fat cells here. And fat is stored in your adipose, or your fat cells, as a triglyceride molecule. That's what's on the top here. You'll notice this is a glycerol with an ester bond connecting to 3 free fatty acid chains. That is a triglyceride. It's 3 free fatty acids linked together by a glycerol. A free fatty acid binds them to let me back up. So what happens in this fat flux process is that you got these triglyceride molecules in your fat cells. Your body then separates or cleaves off the glycerol from the 3 free fatty acids. The free fatty acids bind to something called albumin, and they go into circulation, into your blood. So now you have these 3 free fatty acid molecules in the blood, and guess what? The body can burn those directly in muscle and other tissues. Those 3 free fatty acids, that's what you're primarily running on when you're keto. It's not ketones, it's those free fatty acids. And then the glycerol goes to the liver. The glycerol, 3 of those glycerols can be put together in the liver and make glucose. So you're actually making glucose when you're burning fat. I think it's about 90% fat, 10% glucose when you're running off of your own fat storage, which is pretty handy because then you get a little bit of glucose to run the body. But the free fatty acids, some of them, if they're not burned directly in the muscle or tissues, some of those free fatty acids will go into the liver and get turned to ketones. And those ketone bodies will then go to the brain and neurons and things that like to burn ketones. But again, if you're a fat burner, if you're keto adapted, you're primarily burning free fatty acids as your main fuel. So what happens when you've got extra free fatty acids? So there's this flux of in and out, this cycle. And for whatever reason, it's probably related to fight or flight kind of things where you want to have more fuel around than you may need at any given moment in case you need to suddenly run. But the body is always putting out more free fatty acids than it really needs. And so when you have extra free fatty acids, they get packaged up in the liver as attached back to a glycerol and make a triglyceride molecule. Triglyceride goes back into circulation in a LDL, or not an LDL, in a particle that goes back to fat storage. And then it gets put back into storage as a triglyceride molecule. So this is the flux that's constantly going on, where you have this fat coming out and then fat going back in. And of course, when you eat fat in a diet, then chylomicrons will pull fat into the fat stores as well. That becomes part of the flux, but that's a part of the flux that you don't want as much of, because the fat going in to the fat stores, going back to the fat stores, is adding to fat mass, and then the stuff that's burning in the muscle is subtracting from it because you're burning it up. So this is your the flux of fat in and out of your fat cells, and you just want more coming out than you have going back in. That is fat loss. So let's look at that a little bit. And this constant cycle that's happening, keto primes you to burn fat as your fuel. So the body, the tissues actually become adapted to burning fat in the muscle and tissues even better over time. This is your fat adaptation. You become really primed for burning fat as your primary fuel. And of course, exercise and muscle building will burn more of that fat. Dietary fat adds to it. So you want to be in this negative fat flux where you have more fat coming out and less going in. Well, the best way to shrink your own fat cells is to shrink how much come in the diet and increase how much is getting used. And so if you once you're keto adapted and you're primed to burn fat as your primary fuel, if you reduce the fat coming in the diet, the body will keep burning, and if activity level is good, burn more of that fat that's coming out. So you have less coming in, more coming out. That optimizes fat loss. So let's talk about protein-sparing modified fast. So what is a protein-sparing modified fast? Well, a well-formulated ketogenic diet is one where you keep carbs low enough so that you prime the pump, if you will, for fat burning. Once carbohydrate intake is low enough, the body starts burning fat as its primary fuel instead. Again, the oxidative priority. Get enough protein to maintain lean mass. So you want to get enough protein so that you maintain the muscle and tissues. Then you want to let the body use some of its own fat for fuel. This is a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Enough fat to help keep you satiated, but also not too much so that you're not burning enough of your own body fat and losing fat. So you really, if you look at this, any carbs that are eaten will be used as either stored or used part of your BMR plus activity level. The protein will get used for maintaining and building lean mass. Any dietary fat will either get used for your BMR plus activity or go into storage. But in this case, because we're below the BMR plus activity level, this fat here comes from body fat, and this is fat loss. So you start dialing this fat section down to allow the body to burn more of its own fat for fuel. That is a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Well, the easy way to take this to another level is to do a protein-sparing modified fast. You keep carbs as low as possible. In this case, I used 5 grams, but if it's 0, that's great. Get enough protein to maintain your lean mass, plus maybe a little bit more to help with satiety. If you up the protein a little bit to help with satiety, because this is not a lot of calories, the body will then use more of its own fat for fuel. So dietary fat, you've now brought it all the way down to 30 grams, okay? So 30 grams of dietary fat. This ensures, you might say, why not go to 0 and then use a bunch more body fat here? Well, you need a little bit of fat for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins. You need fat for developing healthy hormones. All your sex hormones are from cholesterol and saturated fat. So it's important to have some. So in this case, again, carbs, protein goes to maintaining lean mass, but the carbs, dietary fat, and body fat, and guess what? A bunch more body fat gets used to satisfy the BMR and activity level of the day. Because you've dialed the fat down all the way to 30 grams. And now the body is forced to use more of its own fat for fuel because you also don't have carbohydrates to use. So what's a protein-sparing modified fast day look like? Well, first of all, it's great for breaking stalls and speeding up results. If we have somebody who has hit a stall, and I encourage you to watch Tyler Cartwright's testimony in this conference if you think you're in a stall, because he has a great experience of, you know, a year and a half of a stall where he changed nothing, weighed all his food, everything, and then just suddenly started losing again. That's a real stall, and we don't really fully know why our bodies do that kind of thing. If it's a week, it's not a stall, or a couple weeks. It's just the body's process it's going through. Water weight can affect so many things and all those kind of things. So, but if you have a stall that, or if in general you just want to speed up results, you just want to get faster results, you have something coming up and you want to, for whatever reason, you want to speed up your results, doing a protein sparing modified fast a day, a couple days a week is a great way to speed up your results. Rapid fat loss can be achieved due to low dietary energy. So your fat and carbs are your main energy sources, and so you're limiting them both, and you're forcing the body to use its own. It's called a modified fast because it mimics a lot of the benefits of a long-term fast without the negatives. Long-term fasting, you can lose lean mass because you're not getting any protein, and so this modifies that, getting just enough protein and allowing your body to use its own fat for fuel. You can add a bit more protein, as it says, if you need to, a little bit more than your normal goal. Proteins are very satiating, and protein-sparing modified fasts are actually quite easy, much easier than you think to do. Try to keep carbs to close to zero as you can, and keep fat to about 30 grams or so. So, you know, maybe 30 to 40 grams in that range. So how do you do it? Well, we recommend starting with like 1 to maybe 3 days a week of protein sparing modified fast days, then doing normal keto fat loss macros on the other days. Even though you're eating very nutrient dense foods, animal proteins, we'll talk about that in a minute, you aren't eating much. You're getting like 600 calories total. And so adding a few regular keto fat loss days to eat in the week, in addition to these, ups the nutrients that the body's getting, making sure you're getting enough vitamins and minerals for the body. And it tends to be easier to do once you're already fat adapted. If you're in the first week of going keto, it might be tough to do a protein sparing modified fast. You could still try it, it just might be harder to do than when you're fully keto adapted and your body is used to burning fat as fuel and you're more satiated. So what does it look like? The foods can actually still be very tasty and satiating. You're gonna eat lots of leaner animal proteins, because what's got a lot of protein and not a lot of fat and little to no carbs? Animal proteins, leaner cuts of animal proteins. Very limited plants, because those are all going to add carbohydrates. So things like egg whites, chicken breasts, fish, seafood, leaner cuts of red meats like tenderloin, filet mignon, pork loin. These can all be great things. And all these pictures you're seeing here, these are all meals from our protein sparing modified fast cookbooks. We have one that's available and another one that's coming very soon. Client results. Well, what does this look like when we have people do these? Well, first of all, they love the food. So this is out of our protein sparing modified fast cookbook, French toast porridge. It says it looks like oatmeal is made from egg whites and almond milk, and it tastes like gourmet popcorn. Maple cinnamon poppycock. You're a genius, Maria. Yes, she is. Let's see. Thank you, Maria, for teaching us every day what to do to lose weight and stay healthy. Protein sparing modified fast book is awesome. I'm doing 3 days a week of protein sparing modified fast, and I'm losing weight again. Only 10 more pounds, and I'm good. Thank you. This one, I ate all protein yesterday. We used to call these, kind of an interesting side note is Maria used to call these pure protein days before we knew the term protein sparing modified fast. But we would have people do pure protein days, 15 years ago, because we knew it helped. And this person ate a pure protein day and lost 2.6 pounds overnight. Let's see this result, week 1 of protein sparing modified fast, down 3.5 pounds in a week, 53 pounds total. Followed our traditional keto macros and saw amazing results. Then things slowed down. Had some frustrations, but last week I learned about protein sparing modified fast, did 3 days of it. The rest of the week, regular macros from our calculator, and down an extra 3.5 pounds for the week. So it's a really powerful tool for speeding up fat loss. One of the things you might be asking yourself right now is, you're eating primarily protein. Is the body, very little plants? Is the body okay with that? Is that okay to do in general? So I'm going to talk a little bit about our bodies, how they've evolved, and what they are designed to eat. What did our ancestors eat? Our ancestors, if you look back around 50,000 years ago to the early humans and the Neanderthals, there's been a bunch of studies, and I'll put all of these links in the notes, where they do isotopic analysis of the bone collagen in these fossils of these early humans and Neanderthals. And they're able to identify the nitrogen content to identify where their protein was coming from. Was it plant protein or animal protein, or what was it? This chart showed their results, and you'll see here, the higher up and to the right you go, the more apex carnivore you are. So here you'll see on this chart, there's a lion here, a hyena, and a wolf. The early humans were even more carnivorous than those lions, hyenas, and known carnivores of that time. They primarily ate large herbivore animals, and that is what they sustained themselves on. Here's some more studies, and like I said, there's a lot of these, and we're not going to go into too much detail on this. I'll provide this all in the supporting materials. But again, you're going to see this this example here of this human, that's the X, way up here, being very carnivorous. Neanderthals here are in black, and other carnivores of the time are listed as well. And you're just going to see this constant thread of, these things over here are carnivores, these are herbivores, and we're solidly, the early humans were very much in the carnivorous realm of species at that time. Neanderthals' behavior, diet, and disease inferred from ancient DNA in dental calluses found that it was a heavily meat-based diet of woolly rhinoceros and wild sheep. These Neanderthals obtained much of their protein from very large herbivores. And they also found that had isotopic values consistent with a diet which the main protein sources were large herbivores, particularly bovids and horses. So we evolved and got these big brains because we primarily ate animal proteins. Let's look at our gut and what is different in our gut compared to other primates. So this is the human digestive tract compared to other primates. The human is the hashed one here, striped. So what are the main differences? Stomach isn't a whole lot different, but guess what's different? Colon, cecum, and small intestine. Small intestine is over twice as long as other primates. What is the small intestine good for? Digesting animal proteins. The colon is about a third as long as other primates. What's that good for? Digesting plant materials. The cecum is almost non-existent in humans. And what's the cecum good for? The cecum is where you ferment fiber, ferment plant materials into saturated fatty acids that can be used by the body. This is why we don't really use fiber anymore. Fiber goes right through us because we no longer have a cecum that's capable of processing it. Stomach pH is another example. if you look at stomach pHs across species, you'll find a consistent trend, and that is things that are herbivores that eat nothing but plants usually have a pH around 5 to 6. Anything below 7 is acidic. The lower it is, the more acidic it is. Omnivores have a pH in their stomach of about 3 to 4. So they eat plants and meats. Carnivores typically have a stomach pH of 2 to 3. Humans, stomach pH is 1 to 2, typically about 1.5. So we're even stronger acidity in our stomachs than carnivores. So why would that possibly be? Well, something that is usually around 1 stomach pH is scavengers. So they're carnivores that eat meat that's turning. And if you go back to our ancestral roots, there's been more and more examples of these pits. They found pits in certain regions in I think it was Europe that woolly mammoth bones were hundreds of them are in there. So these early humans were setting up, they dig these pits, they chase the woolly mammoths until one fell into the pit, and then they would kill it and eat it for days. And you think about a cow could feed one human for close to a year, a large cow. Think about a woolly mammoth and how massive that is and how many people that could feed. You could feed a whole tribe of people for months. And they don't have freezers and refrigerators. And so it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that we have a stomach pH that's even more acidic than carnivores. What about fiber? We talked a little bit about the cecum. Here's an example. You see in the red shaded area down here, that's the human cecum. It's basically just kind of a pouch at the beginning here. And you look at other animals, a wolf has a similar little pouch, and a koala bear that definitely eats plants. This is the cecum. It's big curly pouch where all this plant matter sits in there and ferments, and it gets turned into saturated fatty acids. So again, we're much more like carnivores in that respect. What about feeding your gut flora? This study is one of my favorites because it was a very well done study. Randomized controlled trial. And they took two groups of people, randomized into from standard American diet to a 100% vegetarian group and a 100% animal-based carnivore group. And again, it was well done. It wasn't drinking soybean oil and like you see in some of these keto studies. This was eating eggs and steak and whole foods. So they looked at the gut microbiome and to see what would happen with them. And this is the results of that study. First of all, what's really striking is these are the dietary changes you see up here. The fiber, the fat, and the protein. So you can see they switch to the new diet and then they go back. In this case, an animal-based, they switch and then they go back. So you see fiber goes down to 0 basically. And in the plant-based, it goes way up. You get a lot more fiber in this case. Well, what happened to the gut microbiome? So they have alpha diversity and beta diversity. Alpha diversity is the number of types of gut bugs. So say you've got X number of gut bugs, different strains, these bifido and these different strains of gut bugs, and you're looking at how many different strains there are. The beta diversity is how much are there of any given strain. So what's really interesting is no matter what diet they did, the gut microbiome diversity of number of gut bugs didn't change. You have the same different types of bugs in the gut in both cases, before and after. But the beta diversity did change in the carnivore group, and it didn't really change much in the plant-based group. So you'll see certain gut bugs went way up. So there's bugs that in our gut that really like animal proteins. And why is that? Why are you getting 0 fiber but certain strains of gut bugs are going way up, it's because there's a lot of things in animal proteins that our gut microbiome really likes. This is from another study that looked at the prebiotic content of different components, different things. This is in a wolf, so it has like rabbit hair and stuff. But if FOS, which comes from plants, is the most fermentable. But what's next? You've got things like, where is it here? Collagen. Collagen is very fermentable. And so is glucosamine from meat that you get from meats. These are in casein. And there's also things like butyric acid, the things you get from butter and dairy. These are very fermentable things. There's certain gut bugs that love this stuff. But what was really interesting about this study is they also looked at genes responsible for vitamin biosynthesis. So these are the genes that when you have more of them, you can synthesize more vitamins. And what's really interesting is the group that went to plant-based, they didn't really change. But the group that went to animal-based, the genes responsible for vitamin synthesis went through the roof. So why would there be this huge shift in genes for synthesizing vitamins when you're eating only animal proteins? Could it be that you're getting a big influx of bioavailable nutrients? Let's talk about that. Here's a chart. These are the nutrients in superfoods compared to animal proteins. You have things on here like apples, blueberries, kale. These are supposed to be superfoods, right? Blueberries, and you listen to the media, these are superfoods. Well, here's beef, just like a steak. On this chart, the darkest one is the number one on that line. So magnesium, number one is beef. Potassium, number one is beef liver with beef right behind it. So you can see beef is 1 or 2 in the majority of these categories. And beef liver, off the charts. There's probably nothing more nutrient dense than beef liver. It's got tons of vitamins and minerals. It's not number 1 or 2 in all but 1 vitamin E, and that's beef. It's number 1 in that one. So you're getting an influx of all these vitamins and minerals from the animal proteins. So what about just beef? You might be saying, oh, I can't eat liver. Well, we encourage you to incorporate liver if you can. One way to do it is to do like a 1 to 5 ratio. So 1 pound of beef liver ground up to 5 pounds of hamburger, mix it all up, and then make it in a recipe like chili or hamburgers, and you won't notice the flavor, and you really get a boost in vitamins. If you really don't want to do it, beef by itself, look at this, it still wins out in the majority of categories. It's a very nutrient dense food. And a thing that's important to note, and back to that chart with the vegetarians and why vitamin synthesis did not go up, is that there's a bunch of things in plants that can mess with bioavailability and rob your body of nutrients. Let's think about it. If, for example, spinach is really high in calcium, does it really matter if none of that calcium gets absorbed into your bloodstream and just goes out your body? No. What matters is what gets into your body and what your body can utilize. This example is zinc absorption. Oysters, in this study, they looked at oysters and they were eaten by themselves, and then they looked at blood plasma, which is the amount of zinc getting into the blood hours after they ate it. So they ate oysters, and guess what happened? 120 grams of oysters, zinc in the blood went through the roof. Big dose of zinc coming into the body. When they ate the oysters with black beans, only about 1/3 of the zinc got into the body. When they ate the oysters with corn tortillas, almost none of the zinc got absorbed into the body. This is because things like oxalates and these anti-nutrients in plants, they like to bind on to things like zinc and magnesium and calcium, and then the body detoxes these anti-nutrients because it doesn't need them and doesn't want them in the body, and so they get leached out of the body when they're detoxed. And so you get this sort of robbing of the body of these nutrients when certain plants are eaten with the animal proteins. And so when you just eat the animal proteins, you're getting this huge dose of vitamins and minerals. Another example of this, spinach is really high in calcium, as we talked about, but guess what? Lots of oxalates. Meat absorption of iron. So the iron in animal proteins, like beef, you absorb up to about 85% of that iron. Legumes are supposed to be a good source of iron as well. Well, guess what? Only 0.84% of the iron in legumes gets absorbed into the body. So it's not even close, 100 times more iron absorption from the meat. And these charts don't even account for that absorption. So if you could go through all of these and account for absorption issues with like kale, I have no doubts this would be number one on every category. Protein. So primarily eating protein in a keto diet, as well as, especially in a protein sparing modified fast, you're eating the protein that our bodies are naturally designed to eat. We've evolved to have these big brains because we primarily ate protein. Animal proteins are some of the most nutrient dense foods you can eat. And so you're getting a load of nutrients into the body. Our digestive tracts are made to process primarily animal proteins, as we showed. And so protein sparing modified fast means a lot of animal proteins coming in, and that's okay because our bodies are kind of designed for that. So this isn't something that's going to sort of damage your body or metabolism or those kind of things. It's going to maximize how much of your own body fat is burned while providing nutrients and protein to the body to stay healthy. One other little side note, and we talked a little bit about insulin earlier, but I want to talk about it a little bit more here, is that fasting glucose and insulin are important things to know together, because one without the other can really not give you all the whole picture. And here's an example of that. There's a test called the HOMA-IR, which is you take the glucose times the insulin and you divide it by 405. This gives you an index. And if you're above 2.9, this is the danger zone. This is like diabetic range. 1.9 is kind of okay. Below 1 is good. That's where you want to be. And this is kind of like a car. I bring it back to my car analogies. It's kind of like the speed of the car versus the RPMs of the engine, right? So let's talk about that. RPMs of the engine is how fast the engine is turning to move the car that speed. So in this example, let's say our glucose is sitting at a normal 85 milligrams per deciliter. If you just looked at glucose, fasting glucose, you're like, oh, this person is normal. That's a normal glucose level. All is fine. If you then looked at their insulin's 20. This is like red lines. So yeah, you're only doing 40 miles an hour, which is totally normal, but your engine's redlined to do it. And so you're gonna blow up your engine. Your engine's not happy. And so if you did the HOMA-IR calculation, you get 4.5 in this case, well above the 2.9, which is in the danger zone. So this person, even though their fasting glucose is normal, is having issues. They're in trouble. They are essentially diabetic. They just don't know it yet. Another example. Okay, let's say somebody eats primarily animal proteins, and we see this a lot where their fasting glucose maybe floats up a little bit. So it's maybe around 100, 105 milligrams per deciliter. This normally is somebody who was eating tons of carbs or a carb burner, sugar burner. This would be a concern, because if you have chronically elevated insulin because you're eating tons of carbs and it still can't keep your glucose below 105, that's a concern. But in this person, that's not the case. When when you look at their insulin, it's 2. So their insulin is 2, meaning their pancreas is on cruise control. They're low RPMs, cruising along, no problems. You do the home IR calculation, and they're 0.5, which is below 1. They're doing great. There's not too much to be concerned about here. And this is something that, you know, we get this all the time, that my fasting glucose is 100, and, you know, what should I do to bring it down? And well, if you're not eating any carbohydrates, what happens is the body, once you become fat adapted and your body's burning primarily fat as fuel, your muscles will actually reject glucose because they're like, I want to burn fat. They actually prefer to burn fat as fuel, and they want to leave the glucose for the brain or things that still need some glucose. And so they reject the glucose. And that can leave more glucose around because you're not consuming it so much, because your muscles are consuming fat. And that leaves just a little bit more. Again, 85 to 205, that's 20 milligrams per deciliter. That's 1 gram of glucose. So that's, you know, 4 calories of glucose in your entire blood volume difference. Again, context is key. Insulin low, and you're eating very little carbohydrates, you're fat adapted, it's probably not a big concern. It's not a concern at these levels. You know, if you were a sugar burner and your insulin's 20, then it's a big problem. So context is really key, and insulin in general is not the enemy. Insulin is, you die without insulin, okay? You need insulin. You need it to use protein, which is very important. And transient insulin, when you eat, people just get so worried and obsessed about, you know, my glucose went up 10 points, or my insulin spiked when I ate some protein. Well, what's the end goal? Okay, yeah, your insulin's going to go up when you eat protein, but it needs to, and you need protein to live. And so this is just a normal bodily process. And so, yes, you don't want chronically elevated insulin, but you shouldn't be afraid of transients of insulin to do what the body needs to do, which is prioritize fuels and use protein. Insulin also acts as much as a dam that holds back energy. So we think of it as an energy storage hormone, putting fuels into storage. It also acts as kind of a net. You know, if you think about your fat cells, so think of those adipose cells we showed earlier. You've got a bunch of fat in there, and the body, again, doesn't want too much fuel in the bloodlines and blow the engine up, so it's got to hold back all that fat. So you could think of it as kind of a net. Insulin is this net over the fat cells to hold back the floodgates, okay? And that's why you can have somebody who seems fine, but they have a lot of extra body fat. They'll have a high insulin. So even when eating keto, if you have a lot of body fat, if you're 200 pounds overweight, 100 pounds overweight, extra body fat, your fasting insulin is going to be pretty high because it's got to hold back all those floodgates. As you lose body fat, fasting insulin comes down because there's less to hold back. So it's a good way to kind of think of it in that perspective as well. That it's just, you know, it needs to hold back those floodgates to keep your body from having too much fuel in the blood. And the less body fat you have, the less you have to hold back. Fasting glucose can drift up while you're keto. We talked about this a little bit. It's called physiological insulin resistance. Your body's using fat for fuel, and it's saying, I don't need this glucose, and that leaves a little bit more around in the blood. Fat is now the primary fuel, and over time, this typically abates. So you see after a couple of months, you might see some of this effect, but then after a couple of years, it kind of comes back down, and the body just gets more used to, you know, after several months or a year of being this way. It's just, that's in our keto book, we talked about these phases of keto adaptation. There's the first phase, which is in the first couple days, you see elevated blood ketones, but you're not really fat adapted, so you don't have the increases in energy and all that. After about 4 to 6 weeks, then you start to get fully fat adapted, so you're burning fat for your primary fuel, and the body starts to get used to that, and you see the increase in ketones and energy, or just the satiety and energy increases. And then there's still improvements going out 1 year, 2 year. And that's the interesting thing about this is Volek and Finney, Dr. Finney that was on this conference earlier, did a study that looked at athletes, and 1 year after they were keto adapted, so they were in a study here, 1 year later, they stayed keto, and they did another study on performance and fat oxidation rates and stuff, and they were still seeing improvements a year later. So a year later, their body is getting even more efficient in this ketogenic state for long periods. You get better and better at it, and you see improvements. And we see this all the time with clients that people like, man, I've been doing this for 2 years, and I just suddenly lost a couple more pounds, and I feel this and that. It's a process that kind of keeps going. So anyway, conclusion. Once you're fat adapted, again, a well-formulated ketogenic diet is going to dial the fat down. Again, the first week or two, you might have to have a little more fat in the diet just because of satiety and while your body gets adapted. But then dial it down and let your body burn its own fat for fuel. If you hit a stall or you want to speed up your results, add a couple days a week of protein-sparing modified fast. It's really good for speeding up fat loss. And in general, don't fear protein. It's the most nutrient-dense food you can eat. It enables your body to stay strong, and especially as we age, you've heard it a couple times in this conference, the older you get, the more protein you need just to maintain. There's a leucine shift, and you have to have more protein just to maintain your lean mass. So you do not want to fear protein. And it aids in fat loss, because not only is protein not preferentially used as a fuel, it's got a very high thermic effect, which means it takes a lot of energy to digest protein. So like 25 to 30% of the calories of protein you eat don't really count because it takes that much energy to digest it. And in general, insulin is not the enemy. Chronically elevated insulin is. Having fasting insulin elevated all the time, that's a problem. Transients when you're eating, that's the normal body process. You just don't want to have huge transients with like 100 grams of sugar and it goes up so high that it overcompensates and your blood sugars drop and you start to get hungry again an hour after you eat. That's the whole carb cycle. Not talking about that, but protein or insulin going up because you're eating protein, it's not something to be afraid of. So books and services, I'll quickly go through this. Here's our macro calculator if you want to get macros, and it includes protein sparing modified fast macros. If you pick the fat loss with protein sparing modified fast, there will be 2 sets of macros. So you can do this all on your own. We have a YouTube channel where you can check us out. Of course, all of our YouTube videos. Maria's got this wonderful trip next year. If you're interested, you can use the link to check that out. We have, of course, lots of books. Our latest is the Carnivore Cookbook and the Keto Air Fryer book. Those are our published ones, but we also have lots of ebooks. And I'll put the links in here, but this is our protein sparing modified fast cookbook. So if you want to, some amazing, people absolutely love this book. The recipes in here are so good, and it's so good for speeding up fat loss. It's really amazing, and that's why we are coming out with the second book that will be coming out in the next month or 2, and it's The Art of Fat Loss. It's another protein sparing modified fast cookbook with meal plans. And of course, our services, we have courses, lots of free stuff on our blog that you can check out. And we have a keto coaching certification program if you are interested in becoming a keto coach yourself. And that's it. Thank you all.